Yo, what is up you guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with y'all my top 3 lures that I use to catch redfish. So over the past couple of months, I've been on a serious redfish kick, spending a lot of time out there on the water, specifically targeting those reds and learning a lot about them and their temperament. Had a lot of tough days filled with learning experiences and a lot of great days filled with tons of success and redfish. So over that time, I've gained a lot of knowledge and I'm gonna share it here with you guys today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick things off with the paddle tail. All right, so let's go into some of the pros and cons of the paddle tail. Starting with the pros, I would have to say it's just easy. The paddle tail is super easy to use, man. You literally cast and retrieve, cast and retrieve. If you're feeling spicy, you can add like a little twitch of the rod tip. That's it. Super easy to use and it works. It just works. Secondly, the paddle tail is just super versatile. You can rig it in a couple of different ways. You can go with an exposed jig head like this and just kind of really make sure you're gonna be getting those hook sets. Or if you're fishing around a lot of submerged grass, or maybe your casts keep going into the grass line, you could rig it up with a swim hook and come on baby, there we go. And it is gonna be weedless. Not only can you rig it in those 2 different ways, but you can use it in a ton of different situations. Sight casting, search and destroy, you're just trying to cover a lot of water. Paddle tail's your guy. And lastly, speed.
To anyone out there who wants to go fast, anybody.
I want to go fast.
Hey, get him a suit. Hurry up, let's go.
You can really go out and cover a ton of water fast with the paddle tail. It's great for if you're coming back to a spot you haven't been to in a while, you're not sure where the fish are at, or maybe you're in a new spot and you're just really trying to cover a lot of ground and get on those guys. You go, throw your paddle tail at a couple of those key areas you pre-planned for your trip. If they're not biting, and you move on. You can really kind of focus in and rule out certain areas that fish aren't gonna be active. Now moving on to the cons, I've really only got one, and it's gonna be spooky. So what do I mean by that, spooky? So I want you to imagine that you're a guy. You're a guy and you're picking berries off a bush in a forest. You're happy with your berries. They're sweet, it tastes good, it's free calories, you're content. That being said, if a deer were to show up, you would try and kill it and eat that meat. It's on the menu, it's something you would go after. However, if a deer were to slowly creep up behind you so quietly that you didn't notice, and he's so close that you can practically feel his breath on the back of your neck, you would turn around and rightfully be freaked out. You'd probably dart off and reevaluate your position. Your first instinct isn't to just attack the deer. I mean, it startled you. And redfish can be a little bit of the same way. Those guys are down there rooting around for crab, shrimp, whatever it may be in the grass, and your paddle tail, even though it is on the menu, sneaks up behind them and freaks them out. You can spook those guys off, and the paddle tail can be spooky, if you will. Secondly, with the spooky thing, when you're throwing these paddle tails, you're generally gonna have a heavier jig head on, so it's gonna be anywhere from a 1/4 ounce to 1/8 ounce. And when that lure goes and impacts the water, it sends out a vibration in a circle from wherever the point of impact is. And if those vibrations hit the fish and it kind of freaks them out, depending on their temperament, they will just spook and dart off, dash off into a different direction. So with the first example of spooky, there's not much you can do besides throw a different lure, something that's actually gonna trigger a bite and not spook those guys. But on the second example, with spooking them by your point of impact, you can kind of mitigate that a little bit using different techniques like casting your lure actually on the grass itself and then slowly pulling it off. And it's not gonna be as much of an impact, and then you can swim your lure wherever it needs to be. Or alternatively, you could cast far beyond your target and slowly work it through to them. However, you do run the risk of spooking them by slowly creeping it up behind them and startling them. So it's just something to think about when you're targeting these guys, especially if you're using the paddle tail. Overall, to summarize the paddle tail, I would have to say 10 out of 10. It is by far my favorite lure. I've caught tons of fish on it. If you had like a stat tracker that should show all of the fish I've ever caught and what lure it was on, my paddle tail would be way ahead of the game on all the other lures. I will definitely say I always have it tied on. Real quick before we move on to the next lure, I just wanted to go over some on the water footage of me actually using a paddle tail to catch a redfish. So in this situation right here, there's a red over here in this pocket, And you can see there, I noticed him and used the technique where I cast my lure right on the grass line to kind of dampen that sound. And then I slowly pulled it out in front of him, and sure enough, we got a nice solid hookup. He put up a pretty good fight, but we eventually got him in, and it measured out to be a perfect 21-inch redfish. Overall, just a great catch with the paddle tail.
But all the love that I see in that little guy's face makes it worth it in the end. True story.
I'm not asking you anymore. I'm telling you. Eat it.
No, have mercy.
Pop, please.
Eat.
No, eat.
What are you...
Son,
No.
eat
No.
the shrimp.
Please.
Lenny, eat.
No.
Eat.
Put the shrimp down.
So Lenny might not like shrimp, but redfish love it. As a matter of fact, shrimp is one of those main staple foods that these reds are going to be going after, and you can kind of count on them to be dialed in on it. So going into the pros of the shrimp, I would have to say the first thing that comes to mind is less spooky. When you're throwing the paddle tail, to give you a metaphor, it would be like NASCAR. The paddle tail is quick and dirty, fast, loud, and you get the idea. Whereas the shrimp is more of a drift. It's a slow, methodical, thought out process, and you're kind of having to use a bit of finesse with it. You're not just going in there all hot and heavy. That being said, it really depends on the shrimp that you're throwing. Most pre-rigs are gonna be pretty lightweight, so you can kind of lay it out there, versus if you're rigging your own shrimp and you're using jig heads and stuff, it's gonna be the same. So just keep that in mind and think about it when you're using the shrimp. The second pro I would say is the fact that shrimp is a staple for redfish. It's not some crazy thing that they've never seen before. These guys are going after shrimp day in and day out, so you can really count on them to be dialed in on your shrimp lure. So moving on to the cons, the first thing that comes to mind with the shrimp is super slow. You have to work a shrimp lure really slow just due to the nature of the lure itself. It's really reliant on some twitches to get it up in the water column, and then a slow descent down. That descent down is really important because you're gonna get most of your strikes while it's falling. You'll hear people say he bit it on the drop. That's what they're talking about. When the lure is dropping, they come and hit it. It looks right to them, and it's really important that you do that. So what you end up with is a cast out, and then you're just boom, boom, slowly working it back in. It really reminds me of bass fishing and using a wacky worm rig, where you kind of just have to be very methodical and slow with your shrimp. The last con that I can think of for the shrimp is only like half of a con, because it really depends on the shrimp that you're throwing itself. When you're throwing something like a pre-rigged shrimp, for the most part, they're pretty lightweight, and it can be tough to cast it out there on your run-of-the-mill setup. I would never really want to throw this on like my medium power rod with my 3000 series spinning reel, because it's just too big and it feels weird casting something small like this out there. So you may run into the problem of needing like a light action rod with a little bit of a smaller reel in order to cast it properly. You can get it done, but it just feels wrong, and it can lead you to not want to throw the shrimp at all. Overall, on the shrimp, I'm gonna be honest, it's not my favorite lure. Obviously, the paddle tail is. And I find myself using the shrimp occasionally when my paddle tail doesn't work. So let's say I'm on some fish, I know they're there, and the paddle tail's not getting it done for me. I will resort to the shrimp and start throwing that. Some people may disagree with me on that. Some people may agree with me on that. I know my pops is one of those guys who loves throwing that shrimp. He's a very patient guy, and he will just take his time and slowly work it. But there's been days where my dad's trying to use his shrimp all day, and he's slowly working, not getting as many casts in, and I'll have caught a limit of reds on a paddle tail because I'm just moving and getting it done pretty fast. That being said, the shrimp is still a really solid lure. It's the reason it's in my top 3, and you can always count on it to come in clutch when your paddle tail's not getting it done. True to my name, I couldn't actually find any clips of me catching a red using the shrimp. I just really don't use it that often. But here's a clip of my pops using one, and he cast it out to a redfish tail that he saw on the middle of this flat, slowly working it like you can see here. And like we said, man, it is truthfully a very slow process working this lure, but eventually he does pull that shrimp in front of the red, which triggers the bite, and he's got a nice solid hookup. After a quick fight, he lands a red, making for a successful catch on the artificial shrimp.
My lovely lady hump.
I'm not skating to anything with references to lady humps. I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
No, it's not. It's
Gets
gross.
the people going.
It's
No,
disgusting.
that's enough!
And lastly, we've got the Topwater. So the first and only pro that I can think of for the Topwater is it's provocative. It gets the people going. And that's really all you need, man. I mean, there's been days where I will go out and I will throw the Topwater all morning long, catching 0 fish. My pops is catching fish, Nick is catching fish, and I'm just sitting there still tossing the Topwater, chasing that adrenaline rush of getting a fish to come and blow up on it, man. It's so much fun. And it's like a drug. There's a lot of downsides to throwing the Topwater, some cons that we're gonna get into. The only reason you're really doing it is just kind of chasing that little dopamine hit you get when you finally do see them come and blow up on your lure. The first con that I've got when it comes to the Topwater is gonna be hookups. Redfish are anatomically at a disadvantage when it comes to going after stuff on the top of the water. Their mouths are positioned on their head at the bottom, so they really wanna be, like we said, down in the mud, rooting around in the grass and the grass lines for those shrimp and those crabs. They will, as a predator, take any opportunity to strike something on the top of the water, but they have kind of bad aim. And an issue that I ran into as a beginner throwing the Topwater those first couple of weeks was that I would be walking the dog. I would get really excited when I finally got one to come and blow up on it. And I would set the hook before the fish actually had a hold of it in his mouth. And you kind of ruin your chance at catching that guy. So a way to work around that is to really discipline yourself and always remember to just keep swimming. It's just like Finding Nemo, just keep swimming, keep walking the dog, and you kind of want to just go with that same cadence that you've got with the little action until you feel tension. Once you feel tension, then go ahead and try and give a little oomph to get the hook set, but walking the dog and always just keep moving it, because you know, a redfish might come and miss once, miss twice. On that third try, you might get them. And the last con for the Topwater is gonna be trebles. Treble hooks can be such a headache. There's snags galore. There's so many times I've reached behind to grab my rod from the back of my kayak. I'll be pulling it forward and one of the hooks snags the net or it snags my bag, and you have to deal with that. It's just a pain. On top of that, let's say you land a fish, you're handling him outside of water, lose control, he starts flopping around. One of those hooks ends up in you and it's just no fun. Don't want to deal with it. There's really only 2 ways to handle the problem. You could A, be extra careful every time you're using treble hooks, just making sure you're holding the fish with a death grip. You're not gonna lose your grip and have him flopping around, hooks everywhere. And then B, just being aware of where your rod and those hooks are at. You know, turn around when you're grabbing it. Make sure you're not gonna be snagging into other rods or your net or whatever it may be. To summarize the Topwater, it gets a thumbs up from me. It's really one of those things where it's gotta be the right day, you gotta be in the mood. Let's say you get out there early, sun's barely coming up, probably toss the Topwater for an hour, maybe an hour and a half, just try and get lucky. And if nothing happens, then you switch to a paddle tail. It's one of those lures that I always keep tied on just in case you get that itch and you wanna try your hand at some Topwater action. In this clip, I'm throwing the Topwater and working it right along some exposed oyster here. This is something I like to do versus using a subsurface, just because you can work that Topwater right over the oysters, calling in any fish that might be holding onto that structure, and you don't have to worry about getting your lure snagged under the water there. After walking the dog for a little bit, we finally called in a redfish, and you can see here when we slow down the footage that I never actually stop walking the dog. Once I see him blow up and I get that visual, I still go for my same cadence to make those twitches, and it isn't until I feel the tension that I transition that little twitch into a full-on hook set, securing the hookup on this fish. And you can actually see here when we bring this guy up, he is foul hooked, so that just goes to show how poor their aim really is when it comes to striking topwater lures, and just how important it is to not freak out with the hook set. If I would have set the hook as soon as I saw the visual blow up on my lure, I may have just pulled it completely away from him and not been able to hook into this guy at all. Thankfully, at this point in time, I had already lost a ton of redfish by making that same mistake, which really helped to instill the whole just keep swimming thing in my head, which allowed me to stay disciplined in the moment, making sure to take my time and secure the redfish off the topwater. And that about wraps it up for today's video. If you guys made it this far in, I just want to say a quick thank you. It means a lot to me that in your moments of boredom, you choose my channel to entertain yourself or get some information, whatever it may be. It means a lot, and thank you. A ton of work went into this video, and it definitely challenged me as a creator to deliver the content in a fun and entertaining way while also being informative. So I hope I hit my mark. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, all I ask is that you please drop a like for me. It really helps the video to get picked up by YouTube's algorithm and get shown to more people like yourselves, ultimately leading to more traffic to the channel and growth. So again, thank you, and I hope you guys have a great rest of y'all's day. Peace. And lastly, the paddle tail is fast. In the famous words of Eleanor Roosevelt, America is all about speed. Hot, nasty, bad speed. I can't do it, bro. I can't say that with a straight face.